Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's program. I'm Dr. Gabriela Spears-Rico, and I am an assistant professor of American Indian Studies and Chicano Latino Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. Briefly going to introduce myself here and introduce the panel. Hindi, na eransku, Gabriela Erandi Spears-Rico. Kakehevi kina pirinda charaku matlatsingo. Hello, I'm briefly introducing myself in my maternal and paternal languages, Purepecha and Pirinda. I introduce myself with the phrase Kakehevi kina pirinda charaku matlatsingo. I am Pirinda from the community of Charo, Characo Matlatzinco. I'm very happy to join you today from Inishashkadan, Minnesota, Makoshe, the place of white sandstone and the land where the waters reflect the clouds on occupied Dakota territory. I come from Michoacan Purepecherio, the land of the fishermen, and am from the Pirinda community of Charo, the land of net makers. I am also a Purepecha descendant from Uruetaro on my mother's side. I'm very happy today to welcome you to this panel titled Every Child Matters, Indian Boarding Schools and the Journey Toward Truth and Justice, where we are featuring some dynamic panelists, including scholars, experts, activists, and advocates working nationally to address truth and justice as relating to the boarding school investigations currently taking place throughout the North American continent. This is an Indigenous Peoples Week event being co-sponsored by American Indian Studies, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Cook County Education, and CLA Public Engagement here at the University of Minnesota. We are so honored to be accompanied today by these amazing panelists. And I am going to explain a little bit about the structure of today's event. I will welcome each individual panelist to share a 15 to 20 minute presentation about their work as relevant to this important and critical and timely topic. And then after that, we will open it up for Q&A and for discussion. I welcome you to send in your discussion questions as you have them so that as a moderator, I can pay attention to the issues that are most relevant to you and to your interest as our attending audience today. And thank you very much for joining us. So we will begin with Dr. Samuel Torres. Dr. Samuel Torres, him, is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and has been a fundamental part of the team since 2019. Dr. Torres first joined NABS as the Director of Research and Programs, where his contributions have included leading research teams through several projects, such as the Indian Child Removal Study with the First Nations Repatriation Institute and the University of Minnesota, as well as the development of Indian boarding school research and coordinating with the U.S. Department of the Interior's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. Samuel has a doctorate in educational leadership for social justice from Loyola Marymount University, and his work encompasses the impacts of colonization on historical and contemporary education methods, particularly the legacy of boarding schools. With his extensive experience as a researcher, writer, educator, and leader, Dr. Torres holds a deep passion for decolonizing fixed knowledge systems, centering ancestral knowledge and histories, and working in community to promote Indigenous futures. A bicultural human being, Dr. Torres is Mexica, Nahua on his father's side, and Irish Scottish from his mother. In addition to actively learning and practicing Nahua language, traditions, and ceremony, he belongs to the Mexica kinship community, Calpuli Yausenochli in St. Paul, Minnesota. Please help me welcome Dr. Torres, and I will turn the floor over to him.
Tlasokamati, well, Kiwan Shimo Panolti, thank you so much, Dr. Rico Spears. This is a really honor. It's a big honor to be able to have this discussion with each of you today. So I'll just introduce myself real quick. and in my language of Nahuatl, and then we'll get into some really important discussion points. I'm looking forward to questions. So Tonalte no Chime, Nano Toca Samuel, Nanehuali, Los Angeles, California, Iwan El Paso, Texas, Iwan Zacatecas, Mexico, Ninemi Ashkan, St. Paul, Minnesota, Imnisha Ska. What I just basically said to you in Nahuatl was, where I come from, where my family is, where I currently reside on the lands of the Dakota and the Anishinaabe here in Nishaska, Dakota Makoche. I think it's really important that we as Indigenous peoples, we honor and we call respect to the land that we currently reside on. With that, I am really looking forward to being able to offer some discussion points that the other speakers can continue to build off of. And so as the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, I'm honored to share a little bit about our work, a little bit about what the direction of our organization has been, and of course, the roadmap of where truth, justice, and healing has gone and where it can go, as well as, of course, a renewed sense of activism, of action, and of building community power towards honoring our relatives, honoring our ancestors that have essentially been targeted for genocide. And I think that's an important distinction to be made here, and one that we'll get into a little bit more. So NABS was created shortly after a national symposium in actually at the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians in 2011. Leaders both from the United States and Canada came together shortly after the forming of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada in 2008. A few years after that had been initiated, these leaders basically came together and compelled for such a process to be created in the United States. Over the years, of course, we have seen and learned what some of those lessons have been. Where can the United States, in its own experiences, in its own ways, be able to take some of those lessons, utilize them, change what did not work, and build upon those that have. Essentially, NABS, over that time, over 10 years, a decade of being in existence, we have been created to increase public awareness and cultivate healing for the trauma experienced by individuals, families, communities of American Indian, Alaskan Native, and of course, Native Hawaiian brothers and sisters resulting from the U.S. Indian boarding school policy era. We were initially sponsored by the Native American Rights Fund until we became financially independent in 2015. And since then, we have, of course, been carrying out a really ambitious program and set of research initiatives and healing programs. As you can see here, we have grown to actually, we're missing one person. We're hiring, we just recently hired an additional person to help our digital archives endeavors. They're actually starting next month, but we are now a full-time staff of 10, where we have so many incredible, bold initiatives, from research to education, healing programs, and of course, looking at how we can more easily get boarding school records in the hands of relatives, in the hands of educators and policymakers, so that the under-examined issues of the federal Indian boarding school policy, the history and impacts, can be examined in really substantive ways. So just to set the context a little bit on Indian boarding schools, I think it's really important to just provide a general scope and then go into some of those impacts, as well as what we are still dealing with right now as Indigenous peoples and subaltern peoples as a whole. Because apart from these federal policies, I think it's really important to recognize the impacts of federal Indian boarding school policy continues to show itself in myriad ways throughout other types of domestic and foreign policy of the United States as a settler nation. So it's important to be able to contextualize this, not just in a regional, local way, but also as a broad framework that needs to be addressed, and they're not separate issues. So we'll start with a little bit of history here. U.S. Indian boarding school policies lasted more than 150 years, nearly 200 years, and depending on when we want to start that timeline, it could be argued that way back in the 1600s with praying town villages where settlers from Europe came to try to use education as a model to indoctrinate, to convert, and to quote unquote settle an area where indigenous peoples had been already here since time immemorial. Another example that I think can be invoked is that of the California mission system on the other side of Turtle Island, where Spanish colonizers were implementing similar methods of conversion, of indoctrination, and education for similar means. Though over the last 19th and 20th centuries here, I think it's important to look at how forced removal impacted thousands, likely over 100,000, hundreds of thousands of American Indian children from their homes and families. Those numbers are undetermined as of yet because the records that we need to be able to look at through research lenses is largely still missing, and that work continues to be done and called for by groups such as ourselves and others out there. Indian boarding school institutions sought to destroy Native language and culture, ultimately attempting to dismantle Native nations and enable the US government to obtain more Indian land. This would be effectuated by utilizing education as a weapon, essentially systematic indoctrination, whereby settler values of individualism, capitalism, and Christianity were forcibly inculcated in every aspect of schooling. Physical, sexual, psychological, and spiritual abuse were all too common at these institutions. I can barely even mutter the word school in connection to that, though as a legal sense, of course, I think it's important to identify that the United States government wanted to create these schools or a system of schooling to be able to effectuate these means. This, however, provoked widespread social, cultural, and spiritual disruption. Meanwhile, these traumas continue to affect American Indian communities today and intergenerationally. Despite their far-reaching impacts, this history and the continued impacts and effects to Native people remain largely missing from U.S. education curriculum, as well as dominant social and political discourse. They're persistently understudied and undervalued by scholars and researchers. And as you can see here, we've identified, alongside with some collaborations with the Department of the Interior, over 500 of these institutions. And those numbers are still incomplete because the amount of research that still needs to be done is quite Herculean. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. These historical narratives that are embedded within American exceptionalism, imperialism, and white supremacy hold a centuries-long history on these lands that were brought and cultivated by the first settler colonists. Again, we can look, even further before the 1600s to 1492, and even before that with the doctrine of discovery and the papal bulls that essentially rationalized conquest of non-Christian lands. These dominant narratives and ideals of U.S. American society proliferated from deep origins of what has been called manifest destiny, what I just mentioned, the doctrine of discovery. And at the time of the origins of the settler state of early colonial America, Calvinist predestination. These have provoked oppressive conditions toward Native peoples and subalternity in general, shrouded in what one of my mentors, Antonia Darder, calls a culture of forgetting, and essentially packaging all of this as U.S. exceptionalism. One such weapon of a cultural of forgetting is assimilation, and its commitment to the erosion of identity, language, and culture. It is not difficult to see how such a culture could persist and amplify myths of Euro-American superiority, privileging and preserving its own version of history, meanwhile guiding an unfolding national consciousness toward a culture of amnesia. These impacts have had invisibilizing effects toward indigenous peoples, nations, and knowledges, while normalizing a colonial consciousness of discovery and destiny for settlers. So between 1819 when the Indian Civilization Fund Act was passed through the early um, 1900s. This shift in boarding school policies that were seen in the 1960s, when the federal government began transferring ownership of boarding school institutions to Indian nations, the political, economic, and cultural status of American Indian nations changed rather dramatically. Just a few months ago, the U.S. Department of the Interior released an unprecedented volume of research, of which NABS had the opportunity to contribute to. You'll see here the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, alongside Assistant Secretary Brian Newland, sitting next to our Chief Executive Officer, Deborah Parker, and our first Vice President, Jim LaBelle there, who also is a boarding school survivor. This was the press release that preempted the report release of the Federal Indian Boarding School Truth Initiative, Volume 1. It's really interesting. I think it's important to identify that they remarkably and plainly state in that first volume that one of the sole purposes of the Federal Indian Boarding School policy was the dispossession of native land. And so we look at this this graphic here to identify, alongside the chronology of years here, that originally the stewards of 2.3 billion acres of land now occupied by the United States, native land holdings had been reduced to 156 million acres by 1881. As a result of the General Allotment Act in 1887, and hastened by the forced removal characteristic of boarding schools, only about 50 million acres remained by 1934. An additional 500,000 acres were seized by the federal government for military use during World War II, and a series of various acts of Congress during the termination era of the 1950s was responsible for further land appropriation from over 100 tribes, bands, and rancherias. According to Walter Echohawk, by 1955, the indigenous land base had shrunk to just 2.4% of its original size. And we can see how this period of assimilation fits right there in between these broad pillars of federal Indian policy that has shaped the dispossession of land over the last several centuries. So numerous academic texts have examined periods of boarding school history or the histories of single schools, but few have really interrogated this policy era and connected the actions of federal and church actors to the ongoing impacts to Native peoples today. This is largely due to the fact that there is a fundamental social and political misunderstanding, and really a misinterpretation also, of this genocidal period of American history. There continues to be an overwhelming miseducation and dearth of substantive critical examination of Native history in schools, media, and the socio-political discourse in the US. Outside of Native nations and their citizens, most US citizens know very little, if at all, of the forced removal and cultural genocide characteristic of the federal Indian boarding school policy. They knew even less before the findings of the mass burials in Kamloops, Indian residential school in Canada in 2021. Further still, the history of Indian boarding schools in the U.S. constitutes an important source on U.S. history and policy, shedding light on a larger history of removing children from their families throughout American history, a topic that will certainly be studied at increasing rates given similar experiences seen within Indian child welfare cases, where Native children are disproportionately removed from their families and placed in homes outside their culture at astonishing rates. Despite the importance of ICWA, Native children are 4 times more likely to be placed in foster care than white children. Though American Indian and Alaska Native children make up just 1% of all children in the United States, they constitute 2.6%, nearly 3 times the amount of all children who are placed in foster care outside their homes. Similarly, immigrant children at the southern U.S. border continue to be detained and separated at detention camps, while just this summer, President Biden achieved his stated goal of admitting 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, including more than 20,000 Ukrainians that were processed at the U.S.-Mexico border. This glaring contradiction blatantly illuminates the ongoing impacts and contradictions of a federal policy guided by a culture of forgetting. Which is why we need widespread social, and political action. Many things that we have been calling for a very long time: access to boarding school documents and church records, government records, and private archives, the examination of the location of children in marked and unmarked graves at boarding school facilities. This type of work that has been happening for several years in very powerful and profound ways, one of which is joining us today. Marcia Small has been doing an incredible job at leading these processes, these protocols, and identifying the ways in which these processes can be done in respect of Indigenous protocols and in sacred ways. The opportunity for survivors to offer testimony in culturally appropriate public hearings, educational and political apparatuses that recognize and educate citizens on the history and impacts, and of course the right to direct one's own healing utilizing traditional or contemporary healing methods, essentially creating enough resources and apparatuses for individuals that have been affected by this and communities to be able to go into healing in their own way. Of course, accountability of those who committed crimes or covered up crimes, and then the restoration of language, culture, lifeways, and land. Just recently, we had a webinar trying to get out some social action and activism for folks to be able to call elected officials to implement and advocate what is now seen as HR 5444 S 2907, the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act. Some congressional legislation that would essentially accomplish most of what these aforementioned items would entail. I invite you to do a little bit more research. There's a lot of resources that we have here at boardingschoolhealing.org/Truth Commission, and I want to end by invoking the words of NIHB Executive Director Stacy Bolin. She was reflecting on the fact that the federal policy of boarding schools amounted to 100 years of funding and organization for the objective of erasure for American Indian and Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian folks. It can be argued that this policy has been in place for even longer, of course. But with that said, she mentions that maybe we need a 100-year policy of reversing the effects of boarding school impacts. I thought that was really powerful. And I think it's an astute reminder that the intergenerational trauma is not an easy path to reckon with, nor is it something that a single apology, a land acknowledgement, a payment, or even a truth commission can solve. A commitment to healing will demand really ultimately a commitment to a long road that must involve truth, justice, and healing. And if we rush towards what a lot of folks talk about as reconciliation, then we're missing the point. So I think this is going to take generations. We have to acknowledge and recognize that over 100 years of trauma has been effectuated by these policies. It's likely that it will take just as long to be able to engage that intergenerational wisdom, the resources necessary to heal, and to be able to put ourselves on a path towards right relations as a collective people. So with that, please visit our website if you can, boardingschoolhealing.org. Membership is free. There's a lot more information and resources to check in with. But with that, Tlaso Komati, thank you, and really look forward to these discussions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Torres. That was incredibly informative. I know my pen couldn't keep up with the note-taking. I really thank you for educating me personally, as I'm sure other folks in attendance as well. Next, I want to welcome our colleague from the U of M Morris, Chip Beal. Chip Beal is the director of the Native American Student Success Program at the University of Minnesota Morris. Chip has been working in the area of Native American student success and higher education for the past 30 years. He has been at UMN Morris for the past 3.5 years. Prior to coming to the UMN Morris campus, he was the Multicultural Affairs Coordinator and Associate Professor of First Nation Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Superior for 23 years. Thank you, Chip, for joining us. Looking forward to your presentation.
Halito. Yes, I'm Chip Beal. I'm from the Choctaw tribe of Oklahoma. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation. I'm also Chickasaw and Cherokee. And I'm very pleased and honored to be here. I want to just say thank you to Dr. Torres for sharing that incredible information that laid out the true story about what boarding schools have done. I wanted to share, actually, this is an actual PowerPoint that our faculty and staff give to all of our students in the beginning of each year. And I wanted to share this because our entire entering class at the University of Minnesota Morris receives this training, receives this information about the history of Morris. And I think that's valuable because Minnesota is not one of the 5 states that require boarding school information in K-12. And so we want every student who comes to the University of Minnesota Morris to understand our past, our present, and where we're going in the future. So I just wanted to share a few slides from the presentation. I want to start with our land acknowledgement. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and express respect for Native peoples and nations. The University of Minnesota Morris is located along Owobote Wakapa, a place from which Dakota turnips have been dug river. On the edge of Muskogee Akin prairie land, this land has been cared for and called home by the Dakota people and later the Ojibwe people and other Native peoples from time immemorial. Our state's name, Minnesota, comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Mokoche, the land where the waters reflect the skies. Acknowledging the land and our history in this place is a necessary offering of solidarity with and respect for Native nations and peoples. In doing so, we, the University of Minnesota Morris, reaffirm our commitment to our responsibilities rooted in the campus founding as a Native American boarding school, our distinctive mission as a public liberal arts college within Minnesota's land-grant university, and our federal recognition as a Native American serving non-tribal institution. I wanted to share that because we do take responsibility for where we're at, who we are, and our past. The University of Minnesota Morris is recognized by the U.S. Department of Education as a Native American serving non-tribal institution. We call it a NASANTE. We call it a NASANTE simply because we're a land of acronyms, I think. But to be a NASANTE, the university must have at least 10% of its undergraduates that identify as Native American at these universities. At the University of Minnesota Morris, we officially last year were 27% Native American, and this year we're up. We don't know the exact number. I haven't been told that. I've kind of done some figures myself, and we're at 30% or above this year for our student body. Eligible colleges and universities can apply for NASANTE grants, they're federal grants, and the University of Morris. We have 2 NASANTE grants, both what we call our campus grant that helps for the success of our students, and then we have a cooperative grant, which we are cooperatively partnered with 3 tribal colleges in university in Minnesota. Fond du Lac, Leech Lake, and Red Lake. University of Minnesota Morris is the only NASANTE four-year university in the upper Midwest. I just wanted to show you this slide. As you can see, we're that little red dot all by itself up in the North Country. we're the only one. And we are a former boarding school, and we give a tuition waiver. And that tuition waiver is in recognition that as a former boarding school, we want our Native American students to be able to come to school here in the now, in the new development of who University of Minnesota Morris is. And so we recognize and we offer tuition waivers to all Native American students in the United States and Canada that can prove lineage to a tribal member. There's some other guidelines for that. There's official guidelines that I'm not going to share, but that's basically what it's about. The boarding school era, basically 1878 through the 1930s, even though boarding schools went through into the 70s. At Morris, the first buildings on the land, which is now home to University of Morris, it housed the Indian boarding school. The school was founded by the Sisters of Mercy in 1887 and operated with a contract from the U.S. federal government. And the federal government later operated the school directly until 1909, after the Sisters of Mercy closed their school. In general, American Indian boarding schools, as was shared earlier, attempted to assimilate Native Americans, and they combined with efforts to take indigenous lands, often forcibly separated indigenous children from their families, forbade children from speaking their own languages, and made the children learn English as well as European ways. Traumatic legacy that continues to reverberate. This is a picture of the Carlisle boarding school. As you can see, everybody looks the same, everybody's dressed the same, hair is cut, and that's kind of what they wanted to do. They just wanted to make everybody look what they considered look more like Americans. So this is some themes from boarding school era. Experience loss, experience loss of identity, language, cultures, etc. Experienced abuse. They experienced unresolved grief, and they experienced express ways of healing and trying and attempting and doing and returning to Native spirituality and forgiveness. And so I wanted to shift to Morris as a former boarding school. The things that we know, is research from the past, from the documents that we have by our archivists, by student research, and faculty research. Some of the things that were as a result of that we've learned from this research, that in the time away from home, that parents fought to bring students home in the summer. And the school basically did not want the Native American students to go home in the summer because they wanted them to come back. They were afraid that they would stay away and gain more from the cultures, and their desire was to remove the culture, remove the language, remove, as was shared in an earlier slide, remove the Indianness from these students. The curriculum, parents fought against overwork and pushed more time in the classroom. Parents said, if our kids are going to go to these schools, we want them to learn something, not just to work while they're there. There was inadequate funding, which led to poor conditions, especially in the federal era, and there were many, many runaways. And this is the part that I want to share more than anything, and that's what the University of Minnesota Morris is doing today. As a result of knowing that the Indian remains that were found in Canada, and it finally opened up the eyes of so many people in the United States that these children's remains are there. And what are we going to do about it? So we've had a panel discussion about the possibility of children's remains here on these grounds that we don't know about, that we don't know where they're at. And so we are looking into that, and we've had a panel discussion about what to do about this. Some of the things that came out of this panel discussion and other things that's going on around campus is that we have had a fire ceremony, and the keeping of the fire ceremony by Gabe DeRosiers, our Anishinaabe language teacher, who's extraordinary in what he does here at the university. Then we have every year an annual healing ceremony that is led by Dakota and Anishinaabe elders to care for the children who attended the boarding schools, their families and communities, and us all. This annual healing ceremony has been a lighthouse for so many people, both Native American and non-Native American at the university. This is an all-day event that we start early in the morning with the fire being lit, and the ceremony of the lighting of the fire. Our elders do the ceremony with pipe ceremony, with the giving of tobacco, with smudging, and this theme is carried through the day in a teaching about healing, because we still need to be healed. This has been carried on for generation after generation. And so our students who come here to the University of Minnesota Morris, all of them still have of vestiges of the need for healing. They are the trauma that their great grandparents and their grandparents and that they've carried throughout the generations. We have students coming with those traumas. And then the last thing I want to share with you about our administration, our chancellor, our vice chancellors, our administration's commitment to further research and collaboration with tribal leaders for next steps. We didn't take this journey. We didn't take this direction alone. We have ongoing tribal consultation with our area tribes. We have we're involved in a campus search. We brought dogs to locate areas that might be those areas that maybe children are buried, and we're going to be doing underground research in those areas. We're doing archival work. We're looking to our past to reflect into the future. Each November, we've started an annual teach-in where we bring scholars to the university for our community, our campus community, and our surrounding community about boarding schools and this boarding school and some of the things that's already been shared today. And then we have mental health supports. We have regular counseling. We have mental health programming for our students. We are committed to the truth-telling and the healing journey. In general, I wanted to share, and that's basically all the slides, and the rest of the slides share about University of Minnesota Morris as we're going forward. But what I wanted to share, because it's so easy when you talk about University of Minnesota Morris as a boarding school to get caught up in the realities of the past. And we're committed not only to owning our past and to teach about our past, but to talk about what we're doing now. In addition to our tuition waiver, we have ongoing cultural events. We have a staff in the Native American Student Success Center, Student Success Program that is the best staff I've ever worked with in my career. And we truly are committed to the success of every Native American student who chooses to come to University of Minnesota Morris. And we have over 350 of those students. We're a small liberal arts college located on the land formerly that was a boarding school, the Morris Industrial School for Indians. But we're not that anymore. We're a vibrant public liberal arts college dedicated to the education and the futures of every Native American student who chooses to come to the University of Minnesota Morris. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Chip. That was really powerful and enlightening to hear about everything that's going on your campus. And I particularly appreciated hearing about the mental health support being a strong element about that, because these conversations alone, let alone all of the work that goes into the actual investigation, I imagine, are very heavy topics for folks. We have about 12 minutes left of the program, and I wanted to go ahead and open it up for Q&A from our audience participants. I certainly have some thoughts, that I wanted to bring up for folks, for our panelists to build upon a bit more. But it looks like we do have one question, and I encourage audience participants to submit more questions if you have them through the Q&A feature. One question that is sitting here now is from Yvette, and Yvette asks, what can a common person do to help bring awareness to this history? And so it's probably something that many of the folks in attendance are wondering, and I'll open it up to any of you all to address this question.
Well, I won't be shy. As a national organization, NABS was really formed to address this main question. I just want to share a brief anecdote, because in much of our lobbying efforts to bring awareness about this history and the need for healing, accountability, and raising awareness as a systemic issue in settler states everywhere, really. I mean, United States, Canada, even in the global South as well. There were boarding schools in Mexico as well, though very different kind of distinctions and for different aims. But education was also targeted for Indigenous peoples in New Zealand and Australia, have been seen in China, and many other areas of the world towards Indigenous peoples, toward the goals of assimilation. I think being able to see those connections is really important. But when we share this history with those that, using elected officials as an example, there is not one elected official that we ran into that did not feel some sort of sympathy or a need to, or a desire to want to help. Democrat, Republican, Independent. It is clear that fundamentally these narratives are sorely misunderstood and underexamined. The question is the same that comes up: how can we help? What can we do? And it means really being critical, having the courage to be critical about these commonly held notions of US exceptionalism, of how Manifest Destiny still exposes itself in contemporary society. That's a big picture. I think more of a applicable sort of like, what can I do now? NABS has been created to try to bring resources to the forefront to help people engage in them. Right now, what you can do is call elected officials and ask for uplifting HR 5444, Senate Bill 2907, the Truth and Healing Commission Bill on U.S. Indian Policies Act in the United States is one way that we can go to the next level. If you talk to Canadians about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, particularly First Nations folks, they'll say this was a good start, but in the 94 calls to action, recommendations that were made as a result of this multi-year process, these were published in 2015 and they're deserving of their own examination. About a dozen of them have been really addressed. And there's still a variety of mixed emotions about how they've been addressed. So as I kind of alluded to and really kind of named earlier, it's going to take many generations to be able to actually chart a meaningful path. But in the United States, we need to recognize that this actually happened. And elected officials need to recognize that this is something that is worth discussing and addressing. And a Truth Commission is one of those ways. If you become a member, if you sign up to our e-news, our Facebook and all of that, it's a good way to be able to just kind of see where the discussion is, because we have our pulse on it. We have our finger on the pulse. We are trying to get in touch with folks in Congress and trying to change their minds and do that education. And ultimately, it's talking to Native people that are in your area. It's really getting to know your neighbors, having these conversations at the dinner table with folks. Can you believe this has actually happened in the United States? Unraveling those origin myths that, Thanksgiving is coming up, right? And folks gather around the table and have discussions about all kinds of things. What better time than to talk about the real history of the United States and the unfolding colonial project and its current impacts of the boarding schools than that time. Those are the types of discussions that really help to change hearts and minds. So yeah, I'm sure others have ideas as well.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Such practical advice, literally like a to-do list. I really like that, as takeaways today. I don't know if Chip or Marcia want to chime in on this question about what can common people do to bring awareness to the history.
I will kind of piggyback on what Samuel said. I was thinking the Thanksgiving table also. Sometimes we think that we can't make an influence. We can't because we're just common people. I wanted to share something that I learned a long time ago. The power of influence is greater than the power of position. And one thing I've learned in higher education is that some of the greatest influencers that has changed the course of history in the university setting have been students, have been non-tenured faculty, have been all the, and I guess what I'm saying is I strongly believe in building relationships. And in the idea of building relationships, then you can influence other people by just the things you say, around the dinner table, the things you say in the park, sitting on a bench that somebody might walk up. So I just wanted to piggyback on what Samuel said, is that anytime that we can speak on these things and bring these things up, it's going to make a difference. And it's just one person at a time that we can make these changes.
Thank you.
I can say that just doing this work is hard on people. Send good energies their way. This work is not cheap to do. Donate if you can. But most importantly, is to call your representatives and get it passed. Show that support. Show an overwhelming support for the Indian boarding school atrocities to be recognized, accepted at a government level. The apology from the church, nothing but a Band-Aid. They have the funds. They've certainly made plenty of funds off of the natives. I think even the support of some of the Indian boarding school institutions was from the monies from individual tribal members. I mean, they take the money from the tribal members, I believe, and supported the Indian boarding schools. So there is something in there, but most of all, let's get this passed. Let's get the HR 55 or the I can't even think chief. Anyway, get the House resolution passed, get the Senate passed. Call your representatives in your state, call the ones in your government, and let's do this. Let's start this healing journey.
I'm really grateful for that, Marcia. I want to say thank you to both of the panelists. Your words are so heartfelt. One way I just wanted to say, if you visit that link that's in the chat, boardingschoolhealing.org/truth commission, there's a toolkit there that actually has sample scripts and templates for letters, phone numbers of Congresspeople. So it's not like you have to make up, a whole lot. There's a lot of language that's already developed. Our team has put together a lot of thought and meaningful sample language for you to really just, you don't have to be an expert in boarding school histories to be able to advocate for this, because ultimately the bar for this is so low in the United States right now. We just want to have a discussion about this. We want Congress to be able to have a truth-seeking process, and by calling and just stating, we need this to pass because of these reasons. There are this many recognized tribes in my state, and they deserve that respect. They deserve that honor. We deserve to know what happened.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question that came here through the chat that I'd like to share, which is, we think about schools as something in the past, about these boarding schools as something in the past, but there are still dozens of boarding schools operating across the country. What is the perception of these schools, and are they connected to the historical schools that were discussed today?
I'll jump in real quick. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I want to give a lot of credit to Chip and his team, and really the University of Minnesota Morris handling this very difficult history in a constructive and meaningful way. There are boarding schools that are still in operation. Many of them look unrecognizable. All of them look unrecognizable to what their initial creation state was. But I think looking at University of Minnesota Morris as an important starting point and a model for, instead of wiping this history away and sweeping it under the rug, there is an opportunity to actually be constructive, to address this. When you have Native students and you don't talk about this, often what is seen by what you don't say is more powerful than what you do say about this chapter of history. And so I think that as a result of many of these institutions that were transferred to tribal control, to community control, there's some incredible programs that are actually being had, given the fact that in their history they were initially operated as an assimilative model of an Indian boarding school. Now, this isn't to say that all of them are doing, 100% great things and doing a great job everywhere in all of the places. There are always ways to improve and increase the amount of criticality and engagement with this history. Folks that have relatives that went to these institutions, but we have to be brave and courageous and engage that history and not invisibilize it.
I will speak to one. My tribe, the Choctaw Tribe of Oklahoma, actually has still a boarding school in existence. It's called Jones Academy, and I've always had mixed emotions. And then when I talked to our leader, our chief, about it, he said the big difference is their goal is to teach culture, to teach language, to teach about our creation stories, to teach not along with reading, writing, and arithmetic, but the focus is to keep the culture alive. That is the focus. It's the exact opposite of what the original boarding schools were doing. And I appreciated that. I appreciated what he shared. And there's people that comes to that. There are Choctaw people all over the United States and they want their kids to go to the school. And I don't quite understand all of that. I don't begin to say whether I'm for or against it. But as Samuel just said, it's completely different. It's like the opposite end of a pendulum than what the originals were planned to do.
I'd like to add that Red Cloud, in 1998, started teaching their Lakota language to their students. And that to me is powerful. I'd also like to say that Malcolm Blackout has been instrumental because he's the Truth and Healing Director there at Red Cloud. And they actually brought us in to do some surveys, and we got one coming up in the basement. But they're willing to face these atrocities, what they can, and to bring to surface any of the if anything's there or what. But they're definitely on trying to move forward as an Indian boarding school. And I think we have we're going to do their cemetery, but right now we're just doing a basement cemetery. So I think that Red Cloud by in 1998 starting to teach their language says so much. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We are out of time, and I really want to thank our panelists. This was such a rich and engaging educational opportunity for the folks in attendance. I want to encourage everybody once again to check out boardingschoolhealing.org /Truth Commission for some of those practical steps that everybody can take to take action and be an accomplice in this journey toward truth and justice, as it was discussed today, to do something with the information and the education that you took from this gathering today. So once again, thank you so much to Marcia and to Chip and to Samuel, and thank you to our sponsors, our co-sponsors of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies in partnership with American Indian Studies at the U of M Twin Cities, CLA Public Engagement, and Cook County Education for today's program. And thank you all so much for joining us on this this Wednesday evening for this session. Everybody have a wonderful evening and take care.